Well, what I'll do is I'll get started and let some people in as we get going. But welcome everybody to our session today. Really great continuing to have some amazing content and having your attendance and interest in what we've been doing. So some housekeeping elements. If you've not used Zoom in the past, in the bottom left corner is the opportunity for you to turn your mic on and off. As much as this is a discussion with Francesco and myself, we'd love for anybody who's interested in joining in the conversation to do so. You can also turn your camera on and off if you'd like. There's a chat button in the middle of the center. Feel free to ask any questions you have through the conversation, and we'll hopefully be able to get to them as we're carrying through this. And then if you want to change your view, in the top right corner, there's a speaker view and a gallery view. So if you want to see everybody who's on the call, you can just switch it to gallery view. Or if you just want to see who's speaking at the time, then you can set it to speaker view. But really glad to have everybody here. Today's session is talking about sales advice for brands and properties as we're dealing with the pandemic, and we've got Francesco Gentile here from Sandler Training, Ontario. So welcome, Francesco. And some housekeeping elements for the upcoming couple of weeks. Next week, we've got Alfred White joining us from College Football Playoff. So if you are into college football in the US, you'll be very aware of what this is. This is the Final Four, so think March Madness for football. Talking sort of, tales from the trenches, his experience with it, looking at some of the challenges about just event planning, managing sponsorship for planning for the normal, but expecting that there could be uncertainty for an event that's happening around Christmas and New Year's. So that's coming up next week. And then the following week, we're going to have Brian Lim from MS Society and John Collins from Parkinson's Canada, talking about the fact that they're taking their fundraising events virtual. So we had a great session with WWF a couple weeks back, and there was some really good interest in doing a follow-up with that. So the MS Walk has just recently come through their campaign, and Parkinson's Walk is coming up in the fall. So we'll be able to talk about how they're virtualizing their events as well as bringing on their partners and engaging their partners. So on to today's event. Welcome, Francesco. So Francesco Gentile from Sandler Training. Francesco and I go way back, so really happy to have you join the conversation. You and I have been having a lot of chat about just what's going on in terms of sales and where people are at, and I think we're both of the seen a lot of the similar elements that there's been a process over the last few months. People were froze for the first couple weeks. And then there was this thawing about, okay, what am I doing with my business? And now we're starting to see some planning and activity looking at, okay, we're coming out of this, or we'll be coming out of this. How do we plan and how do we reset? What's your experience been with your business and your clients?
Yeah, that's a good question. In fact, sort of those phases that you described, we actually saw it across the board, even in the first couple of weeks of COVID, is that we began to see almost immediately there was really a pan freezing, right? That whole fight or flight, unknown, and of course there's a lot of ambiguity in terms of, well, what does this mean? Are we really talking about 2 weeks, or are we talking about 2 months? And I think everyone's mindset was closer to the short term. So I wouldn't necessarily say that inactivity was a representation of freezing by a lot of companies, but there was a lot of inaction because there was sort of a let's wait and see. But we began to see not too long into it, almost within the 2 weeks, that it was almost like a bit of people were declaring how they were going to go into this. And so those that were saying, okay, look, this is not going to be very long. We don't need to change or adapt to this. It is a crisis. And therefore, let's focus on health. Let's focus on the well-being of our employees. Let's make sure that we're not making our communities, our clients sick. And so they basically wrapped things up and tried to mothball for a temporary period. Others were, let's try to keep minimal activity that we can, especially those that weren't necessarily dependent on brick and mortar. And then we did see some in our conversations as we were calling out to people. When I say we, I'm really talking about the network within Sandler that I work with closely. So we've got about 8 or 9 offices in Canada, 8 or 9 in Ontario, 22 across Canada, and over 150 in the US and some other countries. And we get together actually on a weekly basis. We created sort of our war room, if you like, where we've been sharing ideas, what's working, what we're hearing, and what we're not. And that's where we began to hear some people really declaring a level of inactivity that was just a bit of denial, right? Kind of wrapped up in some of those things and saying, hey, I just don't want to deal with it. It looks like wait and see, but it really was sort of refusing anything, not looking at what things might look like when we come out of this. They were just really just denying everything. And so even though we saw those groups at this point now, conversations have switched, where there's a great deal of sensitivity towards how are you doing, how is your business, how are your clients, how's your community, a lot of, hey, what are you seeing, what are you hearing, to people saying, look, I don't need someone else to speak to me about COVID and about these crazy times. Don't even use the term crazy times anymore. Why are you calling me? Right? I'm answering the phone because I'm working. Why are you calling me? And that really is, in some ways, it's kind of going back to the way things were, right? You got to call with a purpose, and you have to have a reason to call or to connect, however that communication is happening. And this is we're really beginning to see activity picking up, and people recognizing, yes, we're in a COVID period. However, let's have meaningful conversations, right? And that's kind of the state that we're seeing a lot of people in right now.
Yeah, I think there's been some interesting feedback I've heard from people on the receiving end of calls. And it's been a mix. It's kind of, okay, yeah, this works for my business. People are listening to it. No, we're not doing it, and we're reframing what we're going to be doing for the next little while. And there's been, why are you calling me? There's kind of that pushback. And I think that's a fear for a lot of people on the selling end, because I don't want to disturb the person. I don't want that rejection, I guess, in some ways. And it's just sort of you're starting to see people reframing themselves.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I think actually I've been enjoying almost an easier time during COVID in that part of our business is we do teach cold calling. It works for some businesses. For many businesses, it's not there. And then there's certain people that they don't like it. They don't want to do it. And they're able to generate enough new business without cold calling that they don't have to do it. That's fine. And of course, I'm more of an advocate of warming up your calls before actually doing a cold call anyway. But because it's something that that my clients need from me, I practice it. So I'll do really maybe only about 5 cold calls a day, but just to make sure that I'm able to sort of talk my walk, or walk my talk, forgive me. And during this COVID period, I found that those outliers, those extreme, like, why are you calling me? What is this about? Or is this a sales call? I know exactly what you're doing. Get off the phone, kind of thing. I've had all sorts of those, but they've always been extreme and rare in my business. And in our office, we've been doing this for the last 19 years here in North Markham. So what I found, it's actually become even more rare and more extreme, having those sorts of reactions. And people are, if they do pick up the phone, they're more apt to have that 30-second or 60-second conversation to understand why you're calling, and then give you an honest answer, whether they want to continue that call or not. So and I've seen some of our clients are saying the same thing. They're a little more, people are a little more sensitive, meaningful. They're giving you the time. The flip side of that is that there are far fewer people picking up the phone. So one of our biggest challenges was how do we find people's cell phone numbers? Because calling people's corporate line, their office lines, is not reaching them. Leaving messages, they're not responding to those. They're responding even less. And even though businesses have moved to remote work, for some reason they're not forwarding those corporate calls to a cell phone or to a home line. And so it's a lot of ring, no answer, or ring and an answering machine.
Yeah, and I guess, there's the two elements. There's momentum in, the funnel that you've built before COVID, and now what you're doing within COVID. Does the approach for the momentum you had prior to COVID, are you changing that? Do you pick up? Do you have recommendations for how you regain or build that movement?
That's a good question. So here's some of our experience. Opportunities, any momentum that we had in our funnel prior to COVID, we were able to continue it through to a decision. So any new business, like I would say in the first 6 weeks of COVID, we're now at about week 10, at least, we're here in Ontario. So for the first 6 weeks, any business that was closed was only closed on that momentum, those opportunities that were already in play. And then after that, there was no new business. Now, not all of those really closed because obviously a lot of businesses put things on hold, but at least they got to a decision to say, let's talk about it later in the year, come back to us, we still want it, but we want to see how things pan out. Or they may have seen enough, impact to their business that they've had to say no. If you haven't been nurturing that momentum, then, don't kid yourself, there's nothing to pick up. In terms of, you're not picking up momentum, you're basically restarting the conversation. What that restart looks like depends on the relationship that you have with the individual and how that conversation ended off. But the likelihood is, we've all said it, this may have been 10 weeks, but it's felt like a year already. So if you haven't maintained communication and reaching out to them now, they're going to, you may get that sort of, oh yeah, I forgot about that kind of response.
Yeah, that creates a big challenge. And have you seen a different approach when it's a B2B discussion or a B2C conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's some similarities in those conversations and also some significant differences and adaptations that we're seeing right now while people are not doing the face-to-face. So first of all, on the similarity side is there's been an elongation in the sales cycle in that decision-making process and an increase in terms of the number of times you need to interact. Not necessarily an increase in the work or the output. For example, if your process sort of took you to the point where you were delivering a proposal, a solution, in the sponsorship field around, presenting a plan with activations for an event, it's not like you're presenting multiple scenarios or anything like that. It's not creating that kind of work, but it is sort of increasing the frequency of communication and the number of times you need to meet. And that's just a natural effect of using this form of communication, whether it's by phone, just audio calls or the video calls. The bandwidth, the degree of what you're communicating decreases. You just can't get the same as face-to-face. So you need to plan on more. But in terms of differences between the B2B and B2C is we're seeing that the messaging needs to switch. First of all, kind of initially it was, you're not talking about your proposal or the solution or the requirements of the individual. You're really just sort of maintaining the relationship, nurturing the relationship, just checking in and getting really curious. So rather than that whole we were engaged and I was selling something to you, you would ask me to deliver something and I'm following up and delivering on that. It's switching to let me understand how you're being impacted, what's going on, and what you might think about what we were just discussing. rather than me trying to figure it out and present it to you on a plate. So that B2B conversation has gone back to a lot of questioning, becoming really curious, and fundamentally having to listen, right? We say that's one of the greatest skills of the work that we do, is really asking good questions and then listening for the answers and hearing what's being said. The B2C is different because that type of high-touch communication can be really costly. So unless your transaction is a high value, we're not seeing people being able to afford to have that level of engagement. And so they've had to really streamline and change that relationship between marketing and the selling, and really the digital marketing and what's going on, adding more into how they're reaching out to them from the different social networks, the email, however it is that they've got this set up. And while they are increasing maybe the touch points and offering more information, they're changing the messaging a bit, because now you're really trying to find a way to gather some information from your consumer to see that you're responding correctly or not. I think when we were preparing for this, we had that example of the restaurant. And while some restaurants have gone successfully to increase their takeouts, one of the things that we know is important is that they need to be sensing, are their clients okay with the refuse, the garbage that they're now collecting at home? Some people used to eat out often are not used to now all of this takeout coming into their house, and they're beginning to make choices as to which takeout they're going to go to based on who's being more environmentally friendly or not. And if you're not having that conversation somehow in a sustainable way that's not costing you a lot of money, then you may not find out that you could be missing out on some of those clients, or you could be upsetting some of those clients.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the whole listening piece and understanding what your tone and messaging is. I think about a lot of brands who came out immediately when everything started to shut down, and they switched all their advertising. They switched their advertising off, or they switched to the "we're here for you," and it almost became interchangeable. It didn't matter whether it was a car company or whether it was a bank. All you were hearing was "we're here for you," and then now that started to shift into, okay, here's what we're doing for the community. And as we're starting to see more of that, there's people putting their foot in it in some ways because they just haven't thought through the messaging. And I'm not necessarily picking on Pepsi or Walmart, but there was something that happened in the US, and it was an interesting tone issue where they set up a COVID testing center in the Walmart parking lot. And there was a massive banner advertising Walmart and that it was a COVID testing center. And they had it sponsored by Pepsi. And Pepsi had their regular tagline that was on this banner, and it was "living the life." And it was just such a massive, tone deaf piece of advertising that went out. And I can totally think through the process that somebody at Walmart is saying, well, we don't create this, this material unless it's got a sponsor attached to it. And then somebody at the agency side saying, we never say no to Walmart, so we're going to put this on. There's nobody looking at the holistic piece. So I think you've really got to think about what your messaging is, how that's going to flow through, and then how it's going to be received. I know there's a lot of companies out there that are testing that on a daily basis and feeding that back to people. Mm-hmm. But I'm just thinking from anybody who's on the call, it's just that whole customer journey, as we were talking yesterday, or path to purchase. It's just where do you fit into it with the people who are coming to your events or the people you are trying to bring on as a partner. And maybe it's worthwhile just to circle back to the basics from a Sandler perspective. What are the key points people should be focused on?
Yeah, that's a good question, because I think you're right. It is you have to be extra sensitive to the messaging and sensitive to your relationship. I think it's I don't envy folks in the business, the B2C markets, because you know, the range of what people want and how they perceive things is quite quite broad. But when you're talking in your, you know, your direct B2B conversations, this is critical, that you really understand your messaging and being specific. So like you were saying, that message, that broader message from a marketing perspective of we're here for you, the mirror message in the one-to-one conversations was, how can I help? And it totally makes sense. At the beginning, this is, you know, picking up the phone, how you guys doing? So just, I'm not calling with anything specific, how can I help? And that felt very nurturing, and it was great. However, now, you really need to switch it, because people are getting upset. Don't ask me how you can help me. Tell me, you know, what are you offering? If you're offering to help me, in what ways can you help me? So that's, you know, that specificity needs to start coming back into it. And you know, it needs to be, you need to have sort of that alignment in terms of knowing who you are, what your brand is, your messaging, your why, your what, you know, all of that, how you deliver it, and then translate that into either your specific market niche or your market segments. You can't be everything to everyone, and if you try to be that, if you're trying to message, you send that message of, you know, we're here for you, or how can I help? You know, people are going to get as busy as they were before, and they won't have time to give you that answer. So you need to engage them, at least offer them something. You know, at Sandler, for us, the basic is give people a chance to, you know, to understand sort of high level what it is that you do. We're all very competent professional people that can do many things. But generally speaking, you know, when I introduce myself, I make sure that I practice and rehearse who, you know, what it is that I want to say, and understand who I'm speaking to, so that I give that message. So if I'm speaking to a solopreneur or a very small business of, you know, 1 to 5 employees, I'm going to introduce myself in one way and really just speak to them about 2 or 3 things that I do, and ask them if, you know, does any of that, you know, have interest to you, right? And if it doesn't, then, you know, either I have permission to offer something else, or the conversation may end there, right? If I'm speaking to, you know, a larger organization, then I'm going to have 2 or 3 different things that I speak to, and present that. So number one, be prepared. Know yourself, know the market that you're speaking to, and then prepare your message so that it's succinct, and give people the opportunity to choose from something that you're being very specific about.
And I think that's a lot of what we talk about from our perspective at Sponsor Circle. It's about equity, knowing what your equity is. So you've got to have some thought about, okay, I've thought about your company. I know where you could fit in and what we have to offer that, you know, becomes part of that. You know, and I always relate it back to Tim Hortons and their connection to hockey, which has very little to do with the connection to hockey. It's more about the fact that it's a traditional Canadian experience, and they want to be seen as a very Canadian company. So, you know, what have you got that can bring that kind of experience to the company? So I think, you know, you talk about a discovery meeting and how a discovery meeting runs, and it's a lot about listening. But I think, you know, my perspective, if you go in and you haven't even thought about where they could possibly fit in, that discovery meeting is going to be pretty horrible.
That's you know, and Tim Hortons is a great example, because if you look at who their competition is, you know, what are the big coffee houses where people are buying their takeout coffee from? McDonald's, Starbucks, Second Cup, Tim Hortons. We could probably put a couple of others in there, but you know, those are going to be your big 4. And Tim Hortons is not trying to present or brand themselves as, you know, the baristas of coffee makers, and that you're going to get, you know, the most gourmet coffee from them. It's more about that Canadiana, that experience, that connection to being Canadian. As much as they're even owned by, you know, an international conglomerate, they still, that's the image they want to give, and you'll see that time and again in their advertising, because that's what rings true for them in their markets. And until that doesn't, right, when it doesn't, then they'll change it. But right now, that's where they are. And so if you're reaching into an organization, whether it be Tim Hortons or anyone, is understanding them and what it is. Here's the one thing that I'll add to that, Brad, is that if we really want to be masterful at what we do, is walk in with the humility that we could have gotten it completely wrong. And it's completely okay, because if they turn around and they give you an objection, first of all, is understand, where is that objection coming from? Sometimes it's as easy as dismissing the objection, just to test the waters. One thing I might do is say, let's just say I was speaking to you, Brad. I say, Brad, I'm hearing the objection is this, and I'm going to restate it. Then I'm going to say, but just for a second, let's assume that I can satisfy that objection completely, in a way that meets your requirements, right? Would you then consider continuing this conversation or agreeing to work with us? I mean, it depends on where we are in the process. If we're at the very end, I'm looking for a yes or no. If I'm at the beginning and they've given an objection, I'm really trying to understand, are they giving me an objection because they want to dismiss me altogether, or is it something that needs to be addressed? And if we can, we'll continue. And sometimes what comes up is something completely different. So I don't want that knee-jerk reaction of saying I can fix that and try to answer that objection. I really want to try to have a little bit of humility and just recognize that what they're telling me is valuable, but then ask them some questions in terms of, am I on the right track? Are we moving in the right direction? Because if we're not, then I'm happy to put this aside and just listen. What is it? What would make this really good for you? What is it that you need to achieve that you're unable to do on your own?
Yeah, and I think you hear a lot about the fact that the purpose of the first meeting is to get the second meeting, but I think there's more than just, okay, let's meet again. It's trying to bring those elements in of, okay, let me go think about what you've done, or what you've given me, and then coming back with more to the discussion. And do you have specific framework for how people should work through that?
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, the purpose of the first meeting is to get the second meeting. If I'm making a call, then the purpose of my call is to book a meeting, not to have a longer call. However, the framework for us is, it focuses initially on qualification. And to do it in a way that's of equal service to you and to me. We like to say that when we engage with someone, the first thing we want to do is establish equal business stature. Just because I may be selling something doesn't mean that I'm on bended knee. And just because I may have an event or a property that is of high demand doesn't mean that I hold all the cards in my hand. It really, the best relationships are mutual. And so for us, the framework is around establishing that mutual business stature, and then be able to have an open and honest conversation, so that you get the information that you need to make your decision, and I get the information that I need to make my decision. And the decision that's being made in the first meeting for me is, are you qualified for me to meet you again? And I assume, right, that you're doing the same with me. Do I meet some of your initial qualification criteria that makes sense for us to have a second meeting? And we bucket those into three buckets. There's, for us, it's pain, budget, and decision making. So if I can't qualify a client along those three things, then the likelihood of me staying engaged is going to be diminished, and I'll need to have another business reason to continue. So if I can't find a relevant business reason that you want to do business with me, and that's where we come in from pain. And for me, pain is two sides of the same coin, right? I can talk about benefits, the gain that you get from working with me, and then I can also talk about the pain, the discomfort that you have, that you currently experience. And it could be the discomfort of not having those benefits, or it could be something that you're struggling with in your business right now that I may actually be able to resolve, kind of like Sponsor Circle does in managing that whole process of getting to that point of delivering the proposals and understanding who's using it, who's reading it, how much time they're spending with it. That certainly, as someone who may be presenting a proposal, it's a pain that I have, and you can help me with that. So pain is my first qualification bucket. Budget, I want to answer two questions. Do you have money, and are you willing to spend it? And then my third question around decision making is really kind of putting on a journalist hat and asking the who, what, where, when, and why questions around how do you as an organization or as an individual make the kind of decision that I'm intending to present to you. So if it's a $50 investment or it's a $50 million investment, what's the process? Who gets involved? How do you do it? Why do you do it that way? And I need to understand that as I'm preparing, my proposal or my response to you.
And I think part of that conversation and part of the conversation we had leading up to this as prep, you made a comment about the person who's receiving the call has probably seen 10 of you that are coming in, or may already have somebody who fits that need. So where does that conversation come into play?
Yeah, good question. I think we have this model that we refer to as a success triangle, and we use it to in many aspects of our sales system, the sales process, the steps that we take. And with respect to preparation in our success triangle, there's each corner represents a certain area of work, let's call it. So there's certainly one area which is around what we call our behaviors, and those are just the actions that you're taking, right? It's your plans, your goals, it's the things that you're doing, whether it be day to day, week to week, or month to month. Then there's one other area of the triangle's technique, and over time we get better at different techniques. New techniques are introduced. There's different ways of doing things. 10 years ago we weren't using digital media the way we're using it today, right? It wasn't part of our marketing to sales integration. So there's different techniques and tools that we need to use, get good at, learn. Some adopt and others let go of. And then the third area of the triangle is attitude. And that's really all about sort of your mind, body, and soul, what you bring to this, and the perceptions that you have. And so you mentioned something there about having a conversation or going in to meet with someone. They may have already met with 5 or 10, who knows, 20 different people. The person right before you may be the organization that they've worked with for the last 10 years, and they have the most rock solid relationship that you could ever imagine, right? And when I think in terms of attitude, it is number one, yes, I need to understand the lay of the land. What am I getting myself into? But number two is I can't assume a no on behalf of anyone. So I need to go in with that open attitude as there's potentially something here. If there's a fit, if you meet my qualification criteria and I can meet your qualification criteria, then maybe we should be having a conversation, even if you have a rock solid reputation or relationship with someone else. So attitude can be fundamental in terms of preparation. Is believing that if you see that there is an opportunity, that you've got some value, you've identified some pain, they've communicated some pain, and there's something there, then never assume a no on behalf of a client. Never assume an answer at all, right? Just ask the question, and if you can carry this, and sometimes it's not it's simple, but it's not easy. If you can just carry this in the sense of, well, it's not a client of mine right now, so if I go and I get a no, it's not like I'm losing anything because I never had anything to begin with.
And that's a good approach, and I think it's one of those challenging ones where people go in and they want to do the deal right away, and it's okay. I'm going to come in. I've got my sales package. I've got my rate sheet or my sponsorship deck, and I just need to get it in front of the decision maker. And I always kind of refer back to it as a dating process. And if you're closing the deal on the first date, you're probably not getting into a relationship you may want to be in on both sides. So I don't know, what are your thoughts on if it moves that fast? Is that good for both parties, or should you actually extend it out to more thinking?
Well, I think I don't want to be overly generalistic, because every situation can be unique, and certainly a single transaction exchange can be very possible, especially if the entities know themselves well, or the event or the property is known really well, and what's happening is, is well known and understood, then if you're bringing it down to a transaction level, then it's about meeting that, the information, and making sure you check all the boxes. And look, I think unfortunately in this industry, that's going to be part of the game, right? There are times when you're presented with a request for proposal, and you're going to be doing a lot of work, and you're never ever going to get a chance to meet the decision makers. It's you're going to be speaking to some procurement team, and they're going to be making their decision based on their criteria, and then hand things over to the decision makers who have their own criteria. And one of the things that we advocate is that even when you've got these well-defined criteria, and you mentioned sort of dating, going out on a first date, even these dating applications that may have lots of very clearly defined data fields that they fill out, and they're able to create all these commonalities and match points, they're not capable of really understanding the human psyche and how we make decisions. And the reality is this: we all make our own decisions for our own reasons, and at some point in a larger organization, we will then interpret our personal reasons so that they also make sense on an organizational level, that it meets, say, the organizational defined criteria. But we could spend a whole afternoon talking about individuals who will, in a very safe and environment, will tell you, what, yeah, it looked great on paper, but I just had this feeling, and we decided not to go with them.
Yeah, and that's always gonna be the challenge. That you sometimes you just get relegated to the friend category, and keeping on the.
Yeah. And the opposite is true. We all things being equal, especially when you're forced to respond to an RFP. The one thing that you are being driven to do is to deliver your information in a way that the decision makers can compare apples to apples, oranges to oranges. And so anything that's distinctive about you, anything that differentiates you, is often taken off the table. So, all things being equal, the proposals that make it to the decision maker often all look the same. And then the decision makers are really confounded when they're kind of like, well, how do I differentiate from one to the other? Maybe one is better than the other. And that's where the relationship comes into play, and your technique, your behavior to engage and try to get to those decision makers or communicate with them, or at least to the influencers of the decision makers, and be able to get some sense of, yes, on paper I may fit all the check marks, but here's the added dynamic: who I am, my passion, our team, what we look like, what we really believe, and what we're willing to do in order to satisfy you in this engagement.
And sometimes I found it just that finding that champion, and the champion may be in the the department that you're dealing with directly. It may be somebody outside that, but finding somebody who can, when you're looking at the apples to apples process, that they can say, what, we've had this personal relationship with this group, and are able to have that internal conversation to move it up. And one of the sort of steps, we've got a 5-step process that we talk about when we're putting together strategy. And one is that champion or the decision maker who you're working with, knowing what's going to be good for them for their personal business life. So if you can help get them promoted, or help them meet their KPIs through the activity that you're delivering, that just makes you more important to them. But it comes back to, you've got to have that discovery and the learning.
That's right. And that goes back again to what we say from our qualification. If there's no pain, there's no sale, there's no conversation. So, if the pain is, as you described, in terms of advancing their career, or them meeting their KPIs, right? Or helping them resolve a KPI that they've missed year over year, which is now a real pain. If you can't identify something like that, then the likelihood of you being successful is extremely low.
Looking through some of the advanced questions that people sent, and thank you everybody for sending the questions. There were some great ones, and we've covered some of them so far. If you have any additional questions, drop them into the chat. But one of the questions is just about approaching, and I think you've kind of hit on it a couple times, that it's a call. So looking at the virtual engagement, if I'm sending emails, is that going to get where I want to be? What do you recommend as the approach?
So if you don't have an established agreement with the individual that you're communicating with, then you need, I would say, don't corner yourself into thinking one is better than the other, because we all have preferences. I was just on a conversation with actually the director of education with the Canadian Professional Sales Association this morning, and he was telling me, as an extrovert, he is surprised by how zoomed out he is. He's had so many Zoom meetings that he just wants to have some phone calls now. So we can't assume, even if we know the individual, how they want to communicate and what's the best way. So unless you've asked that question and established it, it's our job to get the communication across the table to the person that we're trying to reach. And so you need to be prepared to use all means, right? So if you can find them on LinkedIn, send them email messages. If they've got a Facebook page and they're active on that, reach out to them there. Use email. Pick up the phone. Pick up the phone. Pick up the phone. And I say this because we rely on electronic communication too much, and in fact, just picking up the phone and making that call can be the one thing that distinguishes you, because so few people use it. Some colleagues of mine in Windsor yesterday were saying how they're preparing for an event that we're hosting in early June, and they're dropping off 200 handwritten letters today at Canada Post, because nobody receives written mail anymore, and so they're saying this is one of the ways that we're going to distinguish ourselves. And the reality is, it's not the letter that's going to convey the message, but what the plan there is that when they pick up the phone in 5 to 7 days from now to call those recipients of the mail, they've got a reason to say, hey, I'm just following up to see if you had a chance to read that letter that I sent. And the answer can be yes or no, but it doesn't matter. If it's yes, they can talk about the contents of the letter. If it's no, then the individual is going to go look for that letter after that phone call, right? So we just need to be prepared to use all means of normal communication. Just don't stalk people, that's all.
Yeah, and I've seen a bit of that, where I get the same email, and it just turned back and forth every 2 days or so, and it's just like, hey, you need to have a different approach if you want to engage me. At least build up the communication so that it feels like I'm busy.
Yeah. I think you and I were talking earlier in the week about our common friend, colleague, Gavin, who's in the industry, and he's been in the industry a long time, and he's taught me, he reinforces this, is you have to have relevance when you communicate. And if you're sending the same email over and over, that is just completely irrelevant. You've got to make it specific. Just as much as you have understand your own why, what you're doing, the market segment or market niches that you're in, then you got to bring it down and be specific in your communication.
And from what Gavin continues to say, and I know, I'm not sure if Michael Colley made the call or not today. I know he signed up, but he's really good at it as well. And it's the touch points. So every touch point isn't a sales touch point. It's walking through, and just sometimes it's like, you had mentioned this business issue. Here's an article I saw. I'm sending you the article. So it creates that relationship, which is very different from every time you pick up the phone, you're asking me for something.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just like, if you see they posted something on LinkedIn, or they've liked something, rather than you liking the same thing, look at it and make a comment about it. or write to them specifically and make a comment to them about what that was, and it's not about making a sale, but it's about the touch points. We've seen different statistics around, how many touch points do you need to have before someone's willing to make a decision? And typically, how many touch points does a salesperson or someone in the business development area typically have before they give up on following up with someone? And these are some generalized numbers, and I wish I could find the source. We've used them, and I know a lot of my colleagues in the U.S. they have the same numbers, and we see things where from a decision maker perspective, 50% of decisions are made, generally speaking, are made after 12 touch points. Okay, sorry, 75%. 50% are made after 8 touch points. So 8 touches, and those touches can be, I've left a voice message, I've actually spoken to you, I've had a meeting, I've sent you an email, any communication to someone that is reasonably, you can reasonably expect that there's been some sort of reception, right? Messenger and receiver, that the receiver has had an opportunity to receive it. So most decision makers, the vast majority of them, after 8, and a larger group after 12. And on the flip side, what we see in terms of typical behavior, so this is where that success triangle comes back in. When I'm looking at behavior, techniques, and attitude, right? What's the typical behaviors that we're seeing that people do, and what are the typical behaviors of really successful people? 50% of people in business development and sales give up after 4 touch points.
And
so most decision makers are after 8 or 12, and we're giving up after 4. There's a big difference there, right? So that alone, forget technique, forget being on message, just being persistent can get you, a good way, to the finish line.
Yeah, and I think it's whether you're a brand making the decision about how you're going to sponsor, or whether you're an organization who's looking for funding, it's about creating those engagement points. So yeah, is it something direct where you're phoning them up or sending them an email? But I think there's also, are they going to be at an event that I'm affiliated with? So do I need to have a booth there? Do I need to be a sponsor there? Do I need to invite them to a virtual event like this, where they can have a bit of an engagement where it's a tangential conversation, but it's something where that movement along the conversation to a proposal or to a decision making really kind of comes into play.
Yeah, I don't think you'd be surprised if I told you that that there's probably many decision makers who look at follow-up as one of their criteria and tests. I've had these conversations with several where they've said, look, I've met some really great people and great organizations, and I love what they had to say, but they didn't follow up when they said they would, and then they disappeared. I'm not going to chase them, is their answer, right? But if they came back to me, I probably would have taken their meeting. I probably would have listened to them. And that organization or those individuals that didn't follow up, they have no idea. They have no idea. So I'll go back to never assume a no on behalf of your prospect or your potential client. Is you have your job actually. So people ask me, so Francesco, should I plan 8 touches and then give up, or should I plan 12 touches and then give up? And I'm like, look, I don't have the real stats on what the numbers are, and the reality is you should plan on continuing to engage and touch that individual in a relevant way that's meaningful until you get a decision. And the decision is going to be either no, yes, or I don't know yet, so keep talking to me, right?
Victoria's got a question in the chat, and I think it's relative to this, going back to your three elements about pain, decision making, business. And if you get a no, do you keep them in the queue, or do you just move on? Because maybe it was a decision making piece, but it's still relevant to their business, or you're still good to their pain point. Is there still value in doing that?
Yeah, that's a good question, and actually, Victoria, if you can unmute yourself, I probably would want to ask you a couple of questions first to be able to answer it, because I think there's a lot of different ways to answer that question. Um, Depends on where you are in your process, right? So if there's no response, and this is sort of, you've just sort of reached out to someone for the first time, then my blanket answer would be, yeah, continue to speak to them. If you made a strategic decision to be engaged with this individual or organization and they don't fully meet your your qualification criteria, then I think that should add some more doubt into, do you continue? Um, as a rule of thumb, I would always say you continue until you get a no, and then find out if you have to qualify the no's, because is it a no forever or is it a no for now? Because it may just be a no for now, but there is some sort of match and they're interested in us, or it may be, yeah, we're never. Well, let's if I give an example, not that they're allowed anymore, right? But if Ontario permitted alcohol companies to sponsor events publicly, or tobacco companies to sponsor events publicly, right? There's certain events that it just wouldn't make sense, right? You're not going to see a liquor sponsor at an event that's primarily attracting families with newborns, right? So that's probably a no forever. But understand, if it is a no, you got to qualify it. If they're not responding to email, then switch it up. Email may have worked, then and for some reason it isn't, then leave a voicemail, or send postal mail, or knock on their door. And again, this is if it makes sense in the context, right? You're in the make your plans for the day that you're in their environment, in their office area one day, and just pop by. You don't really expect to see them, but the fact that your physical presence was there, and hopefully there's a receptionist. I know a lot of offices now have done away with having someone there to receive people, because it's not how they do business anymore. But if you can, then it's just another way of just saying, hey, just checking to see. I was a little concerned that you hadn't responded by email, so I thought I'd pass by and just say hello.
Thank you. I'm not camera ready today, but I think, I think more about my question was, most of us here are in sponsorships or trying to raise sponsorships from corporations and the likes of. And so if you send your amazing deck that either Sponsor Circle did, or you had someone do, or you did it yourself, and it's beautiful, the presentation's ready to go, and you send it and all the criteria meets, and then you send it to that sponsorship manager at that corporation and they don't respond, what do you do then?
Yeah. So I would say, certainly in your preparation, one thing, if you're not doing this now, this goes back to my point on equal business stature. If they're willing to receive your proposal, understand that they're not doing it from the generosity at the bottom of their heart. They have some need. They're willing to invest some time to look at it because they have a need. And so you have a right through your equal business stature, you do have a right to ask, and this to the decision-making criteria, say, okay, when I send you that proposal, how much time do you need before I follow up with you? And get, if you can, be curious and get specific and understand what it is that follow-up is going to look like. When I do follow up, will you at that point be able to give me a decision, or are we likely going to be talking about additional information that you need? And if it is additional information, why don't you tell me what that is right now so I can begin to prepare it? Even if you don't need it in the proposal, I want to begin to prepare it. So preparing to understand, when I deliver that proposal, I'm giving you something, and in exchange, what I need from you is to understand what you're going to do with it and how you want me to follow up. And for me, that's another qualification point. If I don't get that information on how I'm going to follow up, then maybe I'm not going to deliver the proposal, because I don't want to go into that whole disappearing hell kind of scenario where I've delivered something and they now have what they want, they may be shopping it around. Maybe going to their existing sponsor or an event and saying, hey, these people are doing this, can you do that? Right? I don't want to be giving free consulting to anyone. So if I'm going to work hard and deliver a proposal, the least you can do is tell me what you're going to do with it, how long it's going to take, and what our follow-up is going to look like. Now that said, Victoria, you could get all of that and follow up on the prescribed day with the intent based on the conversation that you had, and they can still go quiet, right? But then your follow-up can take a different tone in terms of, okay, you know, we had a meeting scheduled. Looks like you missed it. I hope everything's okay. When are we gonna reschedule? And you're gonna hold them to that initial criteria. There's a level of accountability, of shared accountability. And look, the reality is there's always a good reason. If people give you a commitment and they miss it, most of the time there's a good reason. The business timelines changed. The people that they needed to meet weren't available. There was a personal emergency, whatever it is. So if I have a plan for follow-up before I deliver the proposal, and then I'm executing that plan after I deliver the proposal, then I can become, you know, more sensitive around, hey, you know, we had a plan, we're not on plan, so now I'm concerned. This is not about the business, I'm concerned about you because I know you're a professional and you made this commitment to me. I lived up to my end. You know, I hope everything's okay. And you get back into sort of humanizing that exchange. And generally speaking, people will, you'll get good reasons why they're delaying things, and they'll appreciate that you're trying to understand their situation. Is that helpful, Victoria?
Yes, it is. I would say out of all the proposals I've sent out in the past year, I would say maybe 10% have been on the human level and the rest of them have ghosted for whatever reason. So.
Yeah, unfortunately, you know, I think there's a ranking of professions on, you know, which profession do you trust the most and which do you trust the least. And, you know, people in sales and business development, stereotypically, we are trusted the least. In fact, less than lawyers, believe it or not. If there's any lawyers on the phone, you know, I'm not trying to insult you, but I'm just saying that we keep good company on that low end of the trust scale. Unfortunately, that's the stereotype that we have to deal with, and it's part of what we need to learn to address as professionals. One of the things that we teach, and I know we're running out of time here, Brad, is we call it an upfront contract, and we use that from the very first interaction to the very end, and it's all about setting clear expectations. But we treat ourselves and we hold the people that we're working with accountable to an agreement, much like a contract. Obviously, it's not a legal contract, but we behave in a manner that, look, here's the expectations that we set about this exchange at this, and I'm going to hold up my end, and I expect you to hold up your end.
Oops.
Yeah, I think you've frozen on us, Francesca.
Thank you for clarifying that.
Perfect. Yeah, we're coming up on 2 o'clock. I know we normally go an hour. There are a couple of questions I know we didn't get to, and Francesco, I think we might have lost you. But you know, talking about closing deals without firm dates and numbers, as well as you know, looking at specific segments to target, and couple different elements around that. You know, the specific segments to target question, I think, really needs to be looked at in terms of, you know, what have you got to offer? So it's back to that equity conversation. So it's looking at what I can provide as an organization to different groups, and what that is going to look like to their business needs. So there are definitely organizations who are doing very well right now. A lot of them may be looking at, you know, I'm doing well, but I don't want to publicly tell everybody that I'm doing well. There's been some great stats that have come out about March retail numbers, looking at 2019 versus 2020, and you can go through those numbers and say, okay, you know what? It's not a surprise that the restaurant industry has dropped 50-60%. And you look at the food retailers, the grocery stores, and they're up significantly. Home rental stores are up significantly because people are at home. They're looking at those projects that they've been putting off for so much time, and they've now got time to do it. But just going after them because they're doing well may not be the right thing. You've got to make sure your offering's there. And the ones that are doing poorly, they may be challenged, and they're going to be in that different positioning. Do I freeze and do I stay where I am? And I'm trying to regroup and I'm trying to stay cash positive, or am I going to advertise and position myself so that when we come out of this, I'm going to be in the forefront and people are going to be thinking about me and be more engaged. There are definitely deals getting done, and it depends on the industry you're in and what you have to offer. And the question about closing deals without firm dates and numbers, and I see Fra, you're back on. Do you have thoughts on that as we're wrapping up?
Yeah, so I'll speak really briefly to your point on sort of those that are being successful, whether you communicate it or not, and valuation is I would say as a litmus test for yourself. If you haven't increased your conversations and the questions that you're asking with organizations around trying to understand, do they see the same value as they did before? If you've changed your events and you tried to virtualize them, does it help them satisfy what they're trying to do, or do you need to be talking to someone differently? You need to be having a lot of conversations to figure these things out. You can't just sit at your desk and be really intelligent and strategize this. It needs to be responsive to those conversations, and you'll understand. And if you're having trouble evaluating, then reach out to organizations that help. Brad, I have no shame in plugging you guys, because I know that's one of the competencies you guys have is you can help in evaluating events, and there are many organizations that can do that and people that can do that. So you don't have to do it all on your own, but make sure that you're asking the questions. And Brad, you're gonna have to repeat that second question.
Well, one of the questions that was put out by a number of people was just, my event's been postponed. I don't know when it's going to happen again. We're hopeful. But even if we move into a virtual realm, we don't know the metrics of what we're able to deliver. So how can they close a deal in that, or move their current partners from the apples that they're used to now oranges, and say, okay, is this an equitable trade-off? Do I need to charge more? Do I need to charge less? Or do I need to add into that? So, do you have any recommendations on that process?
Yeah. So don't assume that the valuation is the same or that the valuation is less. And in some cases, you may find that the valuation is greater. And what I mean by that is, even if your normal event is not being held the same way, the sponsor that you're working with may have found that the other options available to them to do the types of activations that they seek to do are not viable. And therefore, they may actually be focusing their sponsorship dollars on fewer events, but they still may have a desire to create the same level of activation. So they may choose to value what you do have to offer at a higher price, so long as it can deliver the activation that they set out to do. And this is, I think, where you need to get into understanding the technique of who they're after and what that journey is. As much as you need to understand your own buyer journey, you need to understand the activations that they seek. What's that journey and the event that you're offering? What's going to be that experience that you're creating for your sponsor's ultimate goal? And then you can talk to it from there, right? If you're able to deliver activation that says, I think we were talking about the OLG, right, Brad?
Mm.
And so, if if you're not going to the racetrack, or you're not going to a casino, right? Then you can't get that experience. But I can now, with the OLG app, I don't even have to go to the grocery store or to the convenience store to buy my, my lottery tickets. I can just buy them online, right? They don't need me or an event to create that activation. So, what's happening, what's changed, and you need to get into that dialogue to really understand. But don't assume anything, right? You got to do your homework and ask the questions.
Yeah, and I think it's knowing who you are, having a basic understanding of who you're talking to, so that you can at least have an educated series of questions to have that discovery call with. And even with your current partners, it's you have to keep up to date on where they are. And I find sometimes you need to pay attention to their stock price. One company I dealt with in the past, and I watched a sales guy pick up and do a call on a day when their stock price just dumped. And it's just knowing that day is one of those challenges.
Even those organizations that are doing really well, just because they're doing well, they may be so busy right now that they don't have time, right? Even if they have budget to do some of the things, they may be so busy they don't have time to be talking to. So you have to be sensitive. By no means go into a conversation and say, I'm a blank sheet. We want to be helpful to you. What do you need? You need to do that homework that you said. Know yourself, know them, have given it some thought to present some things. They don't have to be all well thought out. They can be straw man depending on the individual you're speaking to. Do your homework and be open to pivot if as you're listening to how they're responding to you.
Fantastic. On that note, Francesco, thank you so much for your time. I know that this is something you run as days, if not longer, support elements. So it's been great to pick your brain on this. And if anybody has any questions about Sandler and their process, we'll have Francesco's contact information in the follow-up email tomorrow. Really helpful conversations I've had with them in the past, and just about where you start, how you position yourself, and knowing that it's not always about you having the right answer. It's about learning the right answer as you're engaging with people.
Absolutely. Yeah. If I can just say, send my gratitude, because the work that you guys do in this industry, it's important and necessary, and it's not easy. I know you guys, it's tough. It's very competitive, and things are going to be even tighter as we come out of COVID for some. But truly, I appreciate what you do and how you guys do it and what you go through, and just keep at it. Don't give up.
Great, thanks so much, Francesco. And for everyone on the call, next week we've got Alfred White from College Football Playoff. Really interesting conversation with him, just about tales from the trenches and his experience, and especially looking at the planning coming up to the event this winter, and whether it's even going to happen, and planning for normal but expecting the uncertainty. And the challenges around that. And then the following week, we'll have Brian Lim from MS Society and John Collins from Parkinson's Canada talking about virtualizing their events and how that's looking. So picking up on the conversation we had with WWF about a month ago, and now seeing how that's positioned and rechanged. So thank you so much for joining us today, and look forward to speaking with you next week. Thanks, Francesco.
Thank you.